So thank you, Reggie, very, very much for your insights into the effects of quality childcare and the great work you're doing at the state. And special thanks to Faraday and the parents, Isis, Hudith, Amber, and Kamira. As you said, Reggie, they were very brave to be up here, and we really, really appreciate you all. It's terrific. And to those kids, Violet and Daxton, they were the brave ones. So I want to introduce our final session of the afternoon, Philanthropists Leading Non-Traditional Approaches to Youth Success. And the three people sitting next to me know a great deal about that topic. I'll begin with Dr. Laurie Michaels, to my left. Laurie is an individual philanthropist based here in Aspen. In 2012, she founded the Open Road Alliance to address the lack of fast, flexible emergency funds available to nonprofits. Open Road provides grants to large and small nonprofits facing discrete, unanticipated obstacles on the path to catalytic impact. I love that phrase. She serves on the boards of Search for Common Ground and Access After School, and she was on the board of the Aspen Community Foundation for 12 years. Until 2012, she maintained a practice in clinical psychology. Next to Laurie is Susan Crown. Susan is a philanthropist and business executive with a strategic, results-oriented approach. She's chair and founder of the Susan Crown Exchange, SCE, which goes beyond traditional grant-making by fostering partnerships and collaborations to create social change. SCE focuses in two program areas, digital learning and social-emotional learning, building grit, empathy, and emotion management. In 2016, SCE published Preparing Youth to Thrive, the first field guide to organizations aimed at fostering social-emotional growth in young people. Susan is a member of the Aspen Community Foundation board. She lives with her husband, William Kunkler, in Chicago, and they have 2 children. Our third panelist is Jamie Van Leeuwen. Jamie is senior advisor to Governor John Hickenlooper. He is also CEO and founder of the Global Livingston Institute, an NGO working in East Africa to engage students and community leaders in developing innovative solutions to poverty. His recent research includes articles on mental health services in rural Uganda and a needs assessment for an urban slum in East Africa. He is both a Fulbright Scholar and a Woodrow Wilson International Fellow, as well as a Senior Research Fellow with the University of Colorado Denver School of Public Affairs. Please join me in an enthusiastic welcome for our 3 panelists. So I'd like to begin with a question for each of you to address. Our theme today is about challenging the status quo. You are each leading a non-traditional approach to nonprofit, to youth success. Could you briefly describe what you're doing and how your own philanthropic focus is, in fact, unique? And Laurie, could you kick us off?
Sure. So far, I have been challenging the status quo for 6 years, and the status quo is winning. But that is not going to stop me at all. So what I'm interested in is keeping impact on track. And a large market failure in the funding of philanthropic initiatives and the kind of money that donors give, which is proposals are asked for, they are filled out, everything is budgeted down to the penny, as you had mentioned before, and then something goes wrong. And there's no money for it. So whoever paid that first money put a lot of money into paying for, contracting for, if you will, a certain impact, and then they left all that on the table because they wouldn't pay another $10,000, $50,000, $1 million, depending on what the size of the original grant is. Now, you wouldn't do this in business. You would not go out and say, hey, I'm going to invest in something really cool. I'm going to invest in a busacito, and then not find out what the real needs are and what the true cost is of investing in busacito. And maybe one of the things you forgot to ask was, what happens if busacito gets derailed somehow and something happens to that bus. Who's paying for that? This is not a question that most philanthropists will ever answer. Open Road has done a bunch of research on this, and out of 400 funders, 85% of them said no, they don't ask in their RFP what can go wrong. Well, if you don't ask what can go wrong, you are not prepared to back up your grantee. I think most of us know at this point what are basic, good, best practices for grant making. It's unrestricted funding, it's multi-year funding, and in my opinion, it is also contingency funding, because that is what is going to make something successful. If you are backing up your nonprofit, you are backing up your nonprofit, and that doesn't mean just in good times. Now, the other thing that Open Road does is we make a lot of loans, well below market price. And those generally go either to nonprofits whose money is promised but delayed, as money often is, or social entrepreneurs who, for some reason or other, have been delayed either in an equity raise or, again, money has been promised and it's not showing up. There are a lot of financial instruments that we can all use to be helpful to people doing very hard work to make the world better. We're not doing that work. I'm not doing that work. I'm sitting around. I've got, finances to be able to do that. They're doing the really hard work, and we should not be making it harder for them.
Thank you. Susan?
First, I want to thank this. Is this working?
Take this one.
First, I want to thank this incredibly dedicated and disciplined audience for sitting here through so many different parts of the program. Also, I'm astonished at how few cookies have been eaten. It's us and then the Antler Bar, so if you want your cookie, now's the time. SCE is, I've heard a lot of really interesting things today. I got great descriptions for, when people describe what you're doing more articulately than you do. Well, that's kind of what I got today. Respect and disruption is what SCE does. We're a very different kind of foundation. We don't play the usual sort of power tilt games. What we do is we assemble the smartest people we can find and ask what we think are the most pressing questions in a rapidly changing world. You saw programs that emphasize a lot of the traditional age-old things, reading, writing, socialization. But in a world that's both analog and digital, adaptation is critical. It's a fluency that kids need. And there's also a very different skill set that kids need. All the social science from the past 50, 60 years show that your SAT scores really don't correlate all that well with your life success and satisfaction. However, if you learn to be resilient, if you feel that you're an agent in your life as opposed to a passenger, those are things that really help you thrive. So what we do is we tee up what we think are the hard questions, and we assemble the best practitioners in the field that we can find. And over a period of a year or two, we try and tease out what some very innovative, very brave programs are doing. And we take those practices and we codify them, and then we share them out. So, John, you mentioned the field guide that we put out on helping youth to thrive, and that focused on 6 competencies. Emotion management, because there's often sort of that 5-minute decision that the kid makes that, like, will send them to jail for 20 years. So learning to, harness that moment. Empathy, team building, all those kinds of skills were codified in a book. And we learned from social science that, like biceps, you're born with certain skills, but you can build them up with certain practices. So that's one of the projects that we've worked on. We work with partners. We actually respect people who are on the front lines. As Laurie said, we don't make their jobs harder. And we found that not only highlighting their practices, but also, I don't know what the right word is, sort of validating them and their work, because they're getting paid very little for very hard work, and they're very dedicated, that is equally important. So SCE is an exchange of ideas as opposed to a foundation that thinks it has all the answers because it has the checkbook. And that's a very new paradigm. And we are delighted to be able to learn what we've learned.
Nice. The best part about going last is you just reiterate what everybody else said, and you sound smart. You know, sitting up here with these ladies and actually looking in the room, what we've done over the last 15 years, and my job today is to channel John Hickenlooper a bit, that from the days of mayor, we started building public-private partnerships, and that public-private partnerships and work around homelessness and Denver's Road Home to literacy in One Book for Colorado was rooted and grounded in not going and getting people to write checks and give us a bunch of money so that we could spend it. It was about leveraging those partnerships and really engaging the private sector. And I think that one of the things that, I'll brag on my boss, one of the things I think he does exceptionally well is building those public-private partnerships and the role of the private sector in solving some of our complex social issues. And we did that in partnership with actually a lot of people in this room who could easily be on this panel. You know, Rennie Fagan and the Colorado Nonprofit Association worked with our private sector and worked with our public sector to leverage resources. And, you know, Dr. McAfee talked about it in terms of collaboration. Collaboration, everybody says they do it. Not very many people do because it's really hard to do. And you have to give something up and you have to bring something to the table to do it. And it's quite honestly a lot easier just to say, hey, we're going to solve homelessness. We got it. It's a lot harder to bring parents who have homeless kids to the table and have them be part of the conversation. It's a lot harder to bring your private sector that's investing in what you're doing to the table and is going to hold you accountable and have them sit with you and ask you the tough questions. But when you do that, and you create a seat at the table for everybody, and not just the people who love what you're doing, but the people who are the most critical of what you're doing, and you engage those sectors and you leverage those resources, some really awesome things happen. We went back and we looked. I've worked with John Hickenlooper for 15 years now. We're growing old together, and I go back to the days of mayor. We went and looked at all the different initiatives that we've done, and a lot of those initiatives were supported and championed by people in Aspen and around the state. Over the last 15 years, we raised over $300 million in foundation and private sector support to advance initiatives that we didn't have taxpayer dollars for, that we didn't have resources to be able to execute, and that wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for the support of the private sector and the philanthropic community. But what's really important about those initiatives is not whether or not those resources came together, but how we leverage those and how we push them out in the community, and what are those outcomes and what does that look like, and how do we deliver and do what we say we're going to do, and holding us accountable. And so these conversations are so important because I think a lot of that magic is happening in Colorado. I think it's happening with folks like Laurie who say, hey, we're going to rethink this a little bit. We're going to do philanthropy a little bit differently than the way you're used to. Let's be creative and smart about how we push those initiatives forward. And let's make sure that we have the right people in the room to do it.
Laurie, we heard Dr. McAfee this morning, or earlier, it seems like this morning, earlier this afternoon, talk about the finite number of children in this valley. And he said, I wrote down his words, the scale is right here, and that we could be a model for this, for the country. And that I've heard you say, if memory serves, some similar things in the past. Do you want to talk about your thoughts about that? And Susan, I see you nodding, and you're welcome to chime in on this too. You're all welcome to talk.
The possibilities of what we could do in this valley are extraordinary. Yes, money doesn't solve everything. But in terms of the kinds of things that are needed in this valley, money solves a lot of it. And we should be maximizing that. So we know how to provide after-school programs for kids in elementary school and middle school, from Aspen all the way down. We know how to provide early education. We know how to get more buses. We know how to do this stuff. We know many of the needs of the school because Aspen Community Foundation has been deeply involved in data collection, but also talking to people and understanding what the needs are. So we live in one of the wealthiest places in the world. I realize a lot of people who are wealthy here are second homeowners. Still, I'm trying to figure out how totally outrageous to be. Look, you can have shit named after yourself in this town for putting money into it. You can be one of the 1,000 donors to this, that, or the other thing, but you could actually be one of the 4 donors who fixes after-school programming in the Valley. Access Roaring Fork, or it's a crowd pleaser. It's a cheap shot, I know. But for example, there is a summer camp that Access After School runs called Boost Camp in Rifle. There is no other programming. It helps with the summer melt because it's academic in the morning and enrichment in the afternoon. It's oversubscribed. It has 136 kids. It's the only thing happening in Rifle in the summertime. So if you're not going to that program and you're that age, your parents leave you home with somebody or other, and you sit inside on beautiful, hot, sunny days and watch TV. Or, for not a lot of money, we can provide these kids with the kind of programming that people in Aspen routinely buy for their kids. And we really shouldn't be living in a valley where there's this kind of inequality and lack of access to the same kind of programming that I bought for my kids up here or existed. It should exist down valley. Does that get it?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm almost envious of the scale that's here. I remember, and it's a huge nod to Cradle to Career, Tamara and Barbara, Mike. You know, to be able to say there are 8,000 kids, 20,000, but how many in the preschool group? 5,000 kids. Okay, I'm from Chicago.
5,000 on your block.
5,000 on my block. And they're noisy, really noisy. But the idea that you could get your arms around these problems because it's a small town. It's also a can-do town where the do-say ratio is pretty high. When people say, I'm going to help, and they do. I mean, you saw that with the fire. You've seen it 1,000 times. To be able to take a problem like preschool and kindergarten readiness and deal with 5,000 kids is a gift instead of, you know, the 2 million kids we have in Chicago, and I don't know how many in Oakland or New York or LA or Atlanta. So I think if it can't be done here with the resources, with the incredible soul of this town, and with the numbers, it can't be done anywhere.
Jamie, what gives you hope? Where do you see, what in your work is particularly inspiring?
That's a great question. You know, I've been doing this since I worked with inner city heroin addicts in New Orleans. And I remember when I was at Urban Peak in Denver, I talked to a reporter and they'd come in and I was nervous and I was doing my first interview and feeling particularly smart. And asked me, why are you, where do you find hope or joy around this? Because this is, and what gives me hope is that what it would be like if none of these services existed. I think we've gotten very, very, very cynical, and I think for definite reasons, but I think there's an enormous amount to be hopeful about. I spent half of my time in Africa each year where they would kill to have Gusta Bus, where they would love to have a food program, where they would love to have the human services that we deliver here. And we tend to, I think about all the stories that come out about all the things that we're doing wrong with human services. But what if we spent 10% of that time talking about all the amazing stories that are happening in human services and all the people? Yeah, there you go, Reggie. We'll get beers later. No, but we don't tell those stories. We're not telling those stories now. There's an enormous amount of hope in this room. Look at what Colorado Mountain College is doing with young people, creating opportunities for them to go back to school. And I look at what's happening with homelessness. We have a long way to go, but there's an enormous amount of work that's going into moving things forward. And so I think we have to tell two sides of the story, and I think we missed that. I think that I have a really great friend and philanthropist who reminds me that we don't take pictures of planes landing safely. We take pictures of the airplane crashes, but we don't take pictures of, oh my God, there's kids who didn't have access to early childhood education without Cradle to Career. There's kids, we have a cybersecurity program that's being chaired by leaders in our private sector here that's actually providing access to resources that we didn't have because people stepped up and said, we want to think differently about this issue. And so what gives me hope is there is a lot of people in this room who are sitting here this afternoon having a conversation about things we should be having conversations about.
Thanks. Susan, where do you see the points of greatest leverage in building youth success? Where do you get the biggest bang for the buck? I don't mean necessarily buck as in literally bucks, but for the effort.
Yeah, I'm not, and there are several people who have alluded to this today. I'm not really big on the spray and pray solution to social issues. I think the biggest bang for the buck and biggest bang for the energy investment comes from being really strategic and really getting smart enough to say, okay, this has a good shot of working. Let's test it out. Let's actually, do both the art and science of seeing whether this is effective or not. So the other thing, and it's cliche, but it's cliche because it's true, is investing in the right people, 100% of the time. So having great partners in your efforts, that's where you get the big bang, and aligning, the money with the question. One of my board members asked, anytime we make any kind of investment, what would success look like? What would failure look like? So we don't do anything without considering both of those questions, and then we measure ourselves against those. So I don't know if that was a non-answer or not.
That's a great answer.
Oh, good.
Great answer. And Laurie, what are the biggest gnarly challenges that you face, and how do you address them? You don't have to mention anyone by name.
But you can.
But you can.
I usually call them ma'am. No. The gnarliest problem that Open Road faces is sector change. So just as I said before, that what we're talking about here are good business practices, and they're good obvious practices. Now, for those of you who have ever renovated a home, when's the last time you remodeled your bathroom on time and on budget? And there are no buildings that go up without a 10% contingency fund. So if we are going to keep nonprofits on a shoestring budget, which is how donors generally like to function, we must provide them with the internal resiliency to manage things that go wrong on their own. And same with social entrepreneurs, who we now rely upon to fill in a lot of creative solutions to issues that are happening. What I find in talking to a lot of foundation program officers, presidents, executive directors, is everybody says, oh, we should ensure impact. What an interesting idea. What a wonderful idea. And then nothing changes. And I will say that, although I didn't intend this when I started this, I just thought it was a smart way of funding. There is no other program out there, no other organization that runs the way Open Road runs. There is nobody else that people can go to when they need money immediately. Something has happened. Their offices have been broken into and all computers stolen. Tanzania decides to change its laws regarding certain regulations, that slows everything down. There isn't anybody else who does this, and that's ridiculous. So what I spend half of my time doing, and we spend half of our time doing, is trying to get the sector to change. And that is our gnarliest issue. It's a bit like turning a tanker.
Susan and Jamie, do you want to add anything about challenges and addressing them?
You know, one of the things, I get the opportunity to mentor a lot of young people, and I look at the youth who are coming into the field, and Generation Z and millennials and whatnot. We have to change the dialogue. We've gotten to a place where we want to solve some of the most complex social issues that we've got, and we can't sit at the table together to have those conversations right now. And we solve some of our complex social issues by lobbing a tweet or a Facebook post or attacking each other, and those things aren't going to happen. We're not going to solve the problems that we're talking about in this room by attacking one another and going after one another and talking about how awful the other person is. And one of the things that I have so much respect for with my boss is that we set that very early on, that there was a seat at the table for everybody. The harshest critics, I remember when we were running Denver's Road Home, there was somebody every day who would get on the radio, and I won't name names, and talk about what a stupid idea this was. And my friends would call me and say, hey, they're talking about what a stupid idea this is. Yeah, I know. And I talked to John, I say, what should we do? And he's like, invite him to the commission. Have him be part of the commission. Have them sit at the table and have those conversations. And we've got to change that dialogue, that we should disagree, and we should argue, and we should fight a little bit, but the way that we're doing it isn't working, and we've got to change that discourse if we want to solve some of the problems that we're talking about in this room, and I think we can. When you talk about what gives me hope is when I sat around a table 2 weeks ago with a group of young people from all around Chicago, LA, New Orleans, Rwanda, Congo, and Uganda, and they're having a great conversation, and they're arguing about socioeconomics and equity, and not one of them walked away from the table. And if we want to solve these things, what gives me hope is when I look at those kids, I'm like, oh my God, they're not walking away. Like they're disagreeing and they don't love each other right now, but they're staying at the table and they're figuring it out. We have to do that.
Susan, obstacles or hope? Whatever you choose.
Yeah, I completely agree. The conversation has to change. This independent sector that we're all somehow a part of is the part of society where capital is applied to social problems and people try and execute on solutions. And sometimes government picks up the check and scales. Sometimes they fall apart and have emergencies. But the 20th century way of floating money and ideas is a very old school way of doing business. And especially when you look at government today, which I don't really see rushing in to, help anyone, the way we need to change the dialogue is we need to figure out that we're all on the same team. And where our interests align, we should work together, and where they don't, let other people work together. But to me, the biggest challenge is actually on the foundation side, the level of hubris and the sort of level of hoop jumping and labyrinth navigating that NGOs have to do their work. To me, those days need to be over. It needs to be about the work.
Thanks. This is a question for any of you. What has surprised you? What have you found in this work that you didn't expect, positive or negative, that took you by surprise?
I held a meeting with a bunch of grantees, and they were shocked that a donor was A, alive, and B, in the room.
It's a low bar.
I kid you not.
In other words, not just a name on the
That was
building, but a
surprising.
living, breathing human being.
It's interesting. We're in the last 4 months of the governor's office, and I'm leaving more optimistic than I was when I started. And I am because, we hear the negativity that's happening right now. We have so much more in common than we have, than we're different. I'm looking at the polling that's coming out on our opinions about guns. I'm looking at the polling that's coming out on our differences about our opinions about immigration. And there are things that we disagree on. But we have so much more in common than we have differences. And we've got to start honing in on those and figuring those pieces out, because that's the biggest surprise to me. When I work, especially in the public sector, and I go around and I speak, what I watch on TV and what I hear from the popular media is very, very, very different than what I'm seeing in our communities, what I'm seeing in our classrooms, what I'm seeing in rooms like this. That we could spend all of our time arguing about the 3 things that we'll never agree on, or we could spend the rest of our time talking about the 10 things that we all agree on. I doubt that there's a single person in this room that doesn't believe that a child should have access to early childhood education. I doubt that there's a person in this room that doesn't believe that wherever you are in the world, no child should go to bed without food. We should be spending our time on that and not about the 3 or 4 things that we disagree on the most.
Another one for any of you. As philanthropists, how do you measure success in your own lives, and in your own philanthropy? Excuse me.
My, John.
In your own personal
In
philanthropy
my
is what
personal philanthropy. Several different ways, but mine is easier. So I don't work with a lot of other donors because I do one-time discrete funding for a program that was fully funded by somebody else, ran into a problem, couldn't get money to fix that problem from anybody else, and gets it from me. So how do I judge success? They did what they said they were going to do. So if I'm vetting the problem and they at the end of it did what they said they were going to do, they did educate 6,000 kids in vocational whatever, they did this, they did that, that's how I judge it. Now, if I were to judge the second part in terms of how many funders now ask on their RFPs what could go wrong, or are open to, a lot of what goes wrong with funders is that their policies are not set up to allow emergency funding. So, gee, I'd love to help you, and if 8 months you can submit your application again, I'm sure there's something that we could do about that. And these are large funders and small funders. Everybody has a sort of a way that they do it, and their policies get in the way. When we looked at roadblock analysis of what goes wrong with these projects, in some cases, 40% of what goes wrong are funder related. It's not acts of God, it's not weather related, it's not break-ins, it's funder related. It's funders not getting the money to people when they said they would, it's funders delivering a check that's less than they said they would, it's funders not being able to fund ongoing learning by making changes. Funders need to be more flexible, and that's the part where I haven't had a lot of success yet.
Thanks.
I measure success on what my philanthropists say are successful.
Fair enough.
It's having that dialogue with your philanthropist and figuring out what do they want to achieve, and where do you find that common ground, and what role they can play. Philanthropy is changing so much right now. These ladies know it better than anybody. And how we respond to that and how we engage folks. The days of writing a check for a chicken dinner are going away. Philanthropists want to be engaged. They want to be involved. Yeah, it's good. It's good. But how we engage one another and how we engage in that dialogue and figure out what is it that we each want to accomplish together, I think that's how you measure success.
We have very specific benchmarks, and we stay close. So, and we also take the long view, which, is not very sexy to a lot of foundations. It's exactly what the Community Foundation is doing. Kudos to the Community Foundation for looking at across, a childhood. The second thing that we look at is whether or not we're asking the right questions. So, for example, when we put out this social and emotional handbook, we got 50,000 downloads the first day. And we're this small organization, but it let us know that there was real hunger in the field for the type of stuff we were working on. And we also know when things fall flat, and we're happy to recognize it.
So here's a last question. Dr. McAfee challenged us to think about how we could align systems in America to move 100 million people out of that level of 200% of poverty or below, move 100 million people into the middle class. Now, he made clear that that can't fall on the backs of private philanthropists. But the three of you know an awful lot about the world of social change and how things happen. You also know a lot about public-private partnerships and leveraging investments. Can you imagine this being possible through a much larger sort of public-private level of intelligent cooperation or collaboration, let's say, than we always have today? Can you imagine this as being possible, or is it just far-fetched?
I think it's altogether possible. Call me naive. I think there are three things that solve poverty, and that's giving people access to markets and rights and basic services like health and education. And unfortunately, most of those people are women, and women with children. And when you talked about what did you call it, institutional obstructionism, or things that were designed to thwart progress, if we can remove those barriers, I mean, I actually believe it's not only possible in the United States, but that's how we have a thriving economy. That's how we optimize the contribution that every person makes. That's how we pay less remediating problems. And I think it's absolutely a soluble problem in the United States and actually in the world.
Well, I know Jamie's going to be positive, so I'll tell you what I really think. So we don't end up on my depressing note. No, I think it's far-fetched. I really do. I mean, back to your example about Wells Fargo and how completely absurd it is that Wells Fargo, the Pony Express, is out there saying, we're recommitting to you. Well, what the hell? How did you... I mean, you just ripped everybody off beforehand, and now we're supposed to believe you? So I do believe that that the finances of the world and people who have power are, a sector of the people who have power are always going to be trying to hold on to that for themselves. They see it as a zero-sum game. They don't get the idea that as we all grow and prosper, everybody grows and prospers. So my general feeling about this is that you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. Do I think we're going to fix this? No, not really, but I'd rather be part of the solution.
Jamie.
I think I'll let Laurie answer for me. I'm a little bit nervous about my response. I totally think we could do this. We started on homelessness. I remember as a 26-year-old kid, I went in the room and they're like, the mayor thinks he's going to end homelessness in 10 years. Do you really think you're going to end homelessness in 10 years? And I would say with great confidence, yeah, probably. Anybody who says we can't end homelessness is crazy. In 5 years, we built 3,000 units of housing. We leveraged over $50 million of public-private sector support. We went from 999 chronically homeless people down to a list of 250. We knew exactly where they were because the community came together and we started working together. We started addressing it. 250 units of housing is what we needed to create to address the issue of chronically homeless. And so, I push my teams, I push millennials and they're Z's. They're Z's, right? They're Z's. I push the Z's. We've got to, Laurie said something very, very important at the beginning, this whole notion of the status quo. Like, some of the things we're doing aren't working, so why are we doing them? Like, let's think bigger and think differently. I told everybody on my team with the Global Livingston Institute this year that if they want to be compensated, in addition to what they're doing this year, they have to fail at least once. We're not getting big. We're not trying new things. It's like, screw up. Like, don't do anything dumb on purpose, but listen and think, and then act and do something and try something. And if it doesn't work, then try something different and get crazy about it. And we're not pushing our young people in our schools and in our academies to fail. And it's like, go try something crazy, wackadoodle, that people haven't tried before, and let's stop doing the status quo stuff on things we know isn't working. And at the end of the day, I actually am hugely positive that some of these complex social issues are extremely solvable. And I don't disagree with Laurie. I don't think it's there's a pie-in-the-sky solution to all these things. And I don't think they're going to come easy. But we have to start thinking differently and thinking bigger about how to address these. And the urgency that the mom who's sleeping in the backseat of a car with a kid feels about getting housing needs to be shared by the people who are actually putting those dollars on the table. And if we don't do that, then we can't change the way that things are happening. And I think people in this room know how to do that. Sorry for being positive.
No, I'm a psychologist. I have to be straightforward. I'm glad you're positive. I really am.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, John.
And please thank our panelists.
That was fun.
And thank you all.
All right, we are this close to being able to get a beverage. And before you do that, put a cookie in your bag and take the bags with you. And after you do all that, you can go out and hop on Gus the Bus and see the mobile preschool classroom. But I hope you are at least half as fulfilled as I am. You fed my heart. You affirmed my belief. And I want to thank everybody, John, Laurie, Susan, Jamie, Dr. McAfee, Reggie, the guests. Thank you all for being here, and go out and have a little toast. Thanks.